Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Don't Let Technology Slow Down Your Digital Transformation. Get past technical roadblocks to accelerate your software delivery. My name is Dave Goldberg, Senior Marketing Manager at Digital.ai. To get things started, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Joining us today, we have the one and only Andreas Prins, VP of Product Strategy at Digital.ai. How you doing today, Andreas?
I'm doing absolutely great. Thanks, David.
Fantastic. So before we jump into the presentation, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. And what I actually want to do today in the presentation is take you not only through a journey that our customers experience today and the vision that we have from the company, but I also want to bring in real life experience from my last, I would say, 6-7 years of being exactly in a digital transformation. And before joining ZBL Labs, I was working for one of the larger banks here in Europe called ING. And in ING, we went with the entire bank and the entire IT department through the digital transformation of doing DevOps. And the knowledge I want to bring in today is really the knowledge from me being an agile DevOps coach, managing and coaching a lot of teams and management teams, but also want to bring in real life experience of me being a manager of actual DevOps teams and really transforming the business that we're in. And all this experience is really grounded in the lean background I do have in the field. And I believe that if you take a look at, well, accelerating you as a company and building responsiveness, understanding lean as practice is really important. So I really want to emphasize that today in the webinar as well. And as you know, right, we're working from home, so I do hope technology stays with us, and we're having a great webinar together.
Absolutely. So with that, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Let's take a close look of the topics of today. What I really believe is that if we take a look at IT performance or at digital transformation as such, you shouldn't look only at IT performance, but you should understand the bigger picture of lean. I mentioned that before, but also really focus on why are we actually doing it? Why do we want to build a responsive enterprise? Why is that required in these days? And I believe in the current circumstances, we all get a much crisper and clear goal on enterprise agility, if you like. And I will emphasize a couple of key elements in there. After we've covered these three topics, what I do want to do is take a close look to a couple, and really a couple, just three again, technology movements, I would say, that are going around these days. And I believe that these technologies in particular will help us to increase IT performance. But there's much more. After going through these three technologies, I also do want to take you into a journey of what I call out three important pillars that companies need to focus on. And these three important pillars, they ultimately drive the IT performance and therefore help you to build that responsive enterprise. But before going in there, let's pause for a second and let's see. You're probably familiar with ZBL Labs. We are at this point in time working together and merging with two other great technology companies. So CollectNet version 1, which is doing a lot of agile planning, and at the same time Arxen, which is doing in-app security and protection. And this is really interesting to build a end-to-end platform, and that new company is called Digital.ai. And what we really want to do with this company is help enterprises go through the digital transformation and really lead them towards a more responsive enterprise. And then you might wonder, what is that particular responsiveness that you're talking about? What are the key ingredients? So let's pause there for a split second. What I do believe that if you take a look at responsiveness, ultimately it's there so you can achieve your desired business outcomes, right? Many of the movements that we see going on these days, if you take it from an IT or a development team perspective, it's purely focused on the IT landscape. And I believe that's critical. But what is more important to do first is to take the bigger picture into account. What I believe is important is that you take a look from an enterprise agility perspective and understand, why am I changing my company, my culture, my disciplines, my processes, how people work together. And talking about it, there are three elements that are really important. And the first one is customer collaboration. So where if we take a look back in the last few years, the focus was pretty much on customer centricity. I would argue in the last, let's say, 10 years, I would argue in the last 2 to 3 years, in major enterprises, the focus become much more on customer collaboration. And there's a slight difference. Because if you purely focus on customer centricity, you can almost do it without the involvement of the customer. But if you follow more modern practices like the design sprint and these kind of things, you need to collaborate. And this is important because if you want to be able to respond quickly to changes in the market, you need to have that collaboration. You need to know what are the immediate needs of a customer in the changing environment. So centricity is the customer in the central situation, and collaboration is truly doing it together. And all types of prototyping techniques, but also utilizing a lot of data from let's say production, right? Transaction data, that is important here. Then the second thing is, if you want to accelerate your organization, you need to think about organizational simplicity. I'm absolutely convinced that if you want to accelerate, you need to attack the bureaucracy in your organization, right? Let me give a couple examples. The yearly budgeting cycle. If you want to build autonomous teams and help your teams to accelerate, you need to rethink how you distribute the money. And you need to rethink if a yearly budgeting cycle somewhere in October, November is suitable to predict whatever will happen in the year after December. I believe that this is a principle that needs to be reassessed and that needs to be broken down and really be transformed. Another one is HR. What about your recruitment processes? How do you position yourself? It's important. And another one, for example, really important in here is how do you deal with governance and security, right? Because if you're working in a highly regulated environment, and I've worked in there myself, you need to reassess, for example, your minimum coding standards, or slightly bigger, your auditing procedures. Because if you want to accelerate, you need to look for modern ways to capture data, for modern ways to transform your auditing process so it enables your team to accelerate rather than it's limiting. And at the same time, and that's the interesting thing here, you need to understand that you are in a highly regulated environment. And the good thing there, and I will touch upon it a little later, with today's technology, you can achieve that nice balance between, on one hand, autonomy, and the other hand, a simplification of your process and your organization. And then last but not least, where we've seen in the last 10 years, truly a lot of companies and enterprises setting up innovation centers, I would argue again, in the last 2 or 3 years, really related to the customer collaboration, we're much more focused on data-driven experiments. And why is data so important? Because data really helps us to make much better decisions. The data is key. The usage data, transaction data, is a new feature or capability picking up, yes or no? And by utilizing data, enterprises do have a much better way to accelerate. And with regards to data, well, there's a lot more to say, right? What are the metrics that truly matter? But probably more about that in a later webinar. But understand, data is key to really accelerate your journey, because you need to make decisions that are grounded and are based on data. And these three ingredients together, I believe, will help you as an enterprise to accelerate. Because in the first place, you know much better what a customer wants, right? Because you are collaborating together. You can achieve your goals much quicker because your organization is simplified. And if any decisions need to be made, whether or not you need to continue or pivot, that can be made based on data. And these three will help you to focus much better on business outcomes. And then the second movement is, if we cover the enterprise as a whole, we need to go one step deeper, right? And we need to take the lean or the lean IT view of the entire spectrum. And interestingly enough, looking at the IT landscape, I'm not immediately starting at the IT systems. Let's go one step back, or let's go actually 2 steps back. What I do believe, and what I've seen working really well at our customers, but also in my previous jobs, is you need to assess and you need to simplify your products and the customer fulfillment process first before you start working in the IT landscape. Let me give an example. Imagine you're having a loan or a mortgage product, and on that product there are many options. If you need to build your underlying IT process, it needs to be very complex, because it needs to satisfy all the different options that you offer to your end user. So if you truly take a look at the lean products view, and if you truly take a look at how can I accelerate, you need to simplify your products, get rid of all the bells and whistles, and then you can also simplify the fulfillment process. And that, I believe, is really foundational, because then you can, with much lighter IT systems, fulfill that need. So then the second step, if your process is simplified in your products, you can start focusing on the middle piece, the IT landscape. And again, simplicity is key, because the lighter you are, the faster you can go, the much better you can respond to change when needed. And in here, an example is, if you have a super complex business application stack to fulfill a mortgage or a payment, what are the applications you can get rid of? What are the commercial, off-the-shelf or third-party software pieces that are so complex that you're continuously burying with you? Take a look at it and really understand what is each individual piece and component doing, and is there a much smarter, lighter alternative? And as a side effect of the simplification in the first step, in the middle piece, there are potentially already entire layers that can be taken out. And then the last thing to do here, if you've simplified your landscape, and that can take years, I've seen this from close by, that can take years, you can then finally start focusing on value stream management. What is the entire end-to-end process that is creating the software that matters to the customer? And if you understand that process, that value stream, the flow, you can start focusing on the removal of bottlenecks. You can start automating one step after the other to ultimately, again, speed up the timeline, the throughput time, reduce throughput time, reduce the time that it takes from ID all the way towards a deployment to production and the measurement of that particular artifact in production. And by doing so, you have a really great instrument that is generating a lot of data, and then back again, based on the data, you can decide what piece in my value stream do I need to optimize. So lean, in this case, applied on IT, on DevOps, on whatever instruments that we're using, is a really good instrument to simplify and therefore to accelerate. And remember, the thing that we want to do is the organizational or the enterprise responsiveness. This is helpful because if there's much less to change, you can respond much quicker to changes that are needed or towards stuff that's coming towards you. So lean is helpful, and in that sense, a powerful instrument. And then the last step, I would say, is not talking about the landscape, but truly talking about distinct disciplines that we do have in the DevOps or in the development and delivery space of software. And one really good report that's coming towards us is the State of DevOps of 2019, latest one, called Accelerate. It's the DORA report, and it's really worth reading if you haven't yet. And it's interesting in here in the report, it's that comparing groups of enterprises, where they say from low performance all the way to elite performance, what are the practices they practice, and how does high performer practices differ from the low performers. And what we notice there is that, for example, the frequency of code deployments is more than 200 times more between an elite and a low performer. And then to me, the really interesting question is, what are the IT practices that are underpinning these numbers? And let's take a close look at 3 of them, because what I've seen here in this report, and what you can see if you read it, is automation as such is key to accelerate the delivery. Or if you need to rephrase that, automation is key to accelerate the value stream. The flow of information, the flow of activities, and the flow of work that has to happen to go, again, from an ID all the way to a deployment in production. And I want to highlight 3 interesting ones in this table. And the first one is about automated build. So what I believe, and what we see at our customers, and what Dora is stating as well, is automated build as such is a well-established practice. There's still a difference between the low performance at 64 and the elite performance at 92% having automated builds in place. But overall, you can argue even the low performance are practicing automated build practices. And that's really an interesting one. And we know that, right? Jenkins is everywhere, Azure DevOps from a CI pipeline perspective. So that's a really good habit. But then there are 2 more, well, remarkable observations, I would say. And the first one is truly about the deployment to production. And this is truly the biggest gap in the entire table and in the entire report. And if you take a look at the low performers, they only do automated deployment to production in 70% of the cases, whereas the elite performance run at an almost 70%. That's a 4 times more deployment, automated deployment to production. And the important piece here to see if you go in detail through the report, it's the deployment to production. So the report observed that it's not necessarily that the low performance don't practice automated deployment skills, but what they've observed is the fact they go to production. And that says something about how far your value stream has stretched all the way from your development practices into production or even beyond. So just to pivot it around, if you want to accelerate, taking automated deployment into production really serious is important. And here's another why that is important. It's sometimes not necessarily that the automation capabilities are lacking. It is sometimes, and funny enough, in many situations, more the legal limitations or the segregation of duties that are limiting teams to apply deployment to production. So it's much more in culture and organizational simplicity that this is limiting teams. So if you want to accelerate, please take a look at your deployment capabilities. And then the last one, which is interesting there as well, is the observability into production. So do we know how well the application is behaving in production? And again, there's a big gap, 13% for low performance, all the way up to almost 60% for the elite performance. But still the elite performers, except for security testing and performance, this is the lowest category. And I do think this is an interesting development for all of us, because do we know how the application operates or behaves in production? Observability and tracing can help us with that. But if we do so, it's often from a technical perspective. But now remember at the first page where I talked about data-driven decision making, I do believe that we need to revisit and renew our view of how we utilize observability, because data-driven decision making need to be based on data from production. The observability data, where are people dropping off? How much transactions, how far do people get through if you talk about the entire flow of the customer fulfillment process? So having the ability to do monitoring and tracing is key ultimately to accelerate. So to summarize, 3 takeaways here. Organizational simplicity first. What can you transform? Then taking a lean angle on your IT landscape. And ultimately, IT performance is grounded in good automation practices. And I'm absolutely certain there are practices that all of us can practice a little better and improve on a day-to-day basis. And if that's in place, then we can start looking at how do we embrace technology so we can accelerate even further. And there are a few technologies I do want to highlight. And the first one, I guess, is the most obvious. But what I've seen at our customers is that it's not that the cloud is an issue or that the cloud isn't adopted. What I've noticed is that the discussions and the conversations in our customer domain, where they are discussing what is the best suitable cloud to go to. The majority having a multi-cloud strategy, often 2 public ones and 1 on-prem with OpenShift or whatever. The question is, how do we push our apps to the cloud, and to what cloud do we want to push them? Are we utilizing cloud native capabilities or functions from a particular provider, or do we build it entirely ourselves? So the funny thing is despite the fact that this is the cloud strategy, all of a sudden a lot of more traditional infrastructure questions on standardization or using publicly offered capabilities is super relevant again. And if you take a look, what are the challenges based on company sides? The 4 ones don't differ from 5 years ago, from 10 years ago. Managing the spend, governance, security, and compliance. And later in the webinar, what I do want to cover is how can you revisit the view of governance, security, and compliance? Because I believe that with the ability of automation and the automation capabilities that are available today, you can absolutely be in a much better control from a governance and a security perspective. And the pipelines that we are building today in all our modern tools should adhere to the compliancy. And this is really crucial because remember, organizational simplicity, I talked about the risk process. This is exactly what organizations still haven't solved. And by doing so, you can accelerate and start utilizing the new technology in a much better fashion. So that is really important. Then the second big move that is coming towards us is the entire GitOps and as code movement. And what I really like there is that all the good practices that developers practice of review and merge strategies and whatsoever are now all of a sudden not only applied on the business application, but also on the pipeline definition or on the infrastructure definition or on the, well, manifest files and these kind of code. What we notice as well is that if you start using much more as code capabilities, let's say pipeline defined as code, living in your GitLab or GitHub repository and being consumed by release tools or whatsoever, the way you troubleshoot and the way you standardize is still an issue. So what you need to do, I believe, to take into account also the non-technical users. And this is for some enterprises still a little bit of struggle. They need to balance out the ability of using as code or GitOps practices on one hand, and at the same time, if you have many pipelines connected together, how do you see that easily from a code file? Or if you want to run your, let's say, advanced releases that are stretched over still multiple days, how do you make sure that from the CLI, you get a good view of what's running when, or when it's what's coming? So I do believe that if we start talking about GitOps and as code practices, we need to take into account that a UI is still relevant, and then in particular relevant for the disciplines that are not so used to using a CLI to work with. So that is just one of the things we need to take into account. And what I believe, it had everything to do with the fact that we're just in the early days, not for coding, I get it, but for applying these practices also on other defined domains where other personas are involved. So just take that into account. And then the other one, which I do believe a really nice side effect, is the DevOps as code enables us to start creating patterns up front that are ready for consumption, right? So how can the operation engineers, the site reliability engineers, or the cloud native experts start defining the patterns, right? How do you set up a cluster? How do you make a playbook and define them as code? Whether or not it's a Helm chart, a YAML file, CloudFormation, or Terraform, define them as code, all the way up till your pipelines that you can define with Excel release, for example. And if you do so, and this is really what I believe organizations should take a bit more serious, and you make them ready for consumption, then all of a sudden the DevOps teams, they can just consume whatever patterns are defined. And it has nothing to do with limiting their autonomy. This has everything to do with the acceleration again of the development of new features and capabilities. Because now all of a sudden the experts define it and the teams consume it. And you can almost argue in many situations it was a true DevOps mode, but now we're turning it into an Ops Dev mode. Defined once, consumed time after time, pushing applications, business applications out to production really fast. And the beauty of all these new tools also brings some concerns, right? Let's face the facts. So what we see happening in the majority of our customers is the entire cloud and GitOps tools and practices brings in an entire new set of tools and frameworks. And the question is, and these are just a few of them, then the question is, how do we as an organization deal with it? How do we manage it? What is the autonomy we want to give to the teams on one hand, and at the same time, the control we still want to have? And what we do believe is that if you find a well-defined balance where you start working on predefined patterns, teams can go pretty far in experimenting and utilizing new tools and capabilities. And one of the larger banks, a customer here in the Netherlands, they once made this nice example. They said what we need as a large organization is clear guidance. Yes, there are many tools and capabilities coming towards our organization. And yes, we want to give freedom. But at the same time, what are the limitations? What is the framework within the teams can operate? The second thing they said is if we then start experimenting, right? We start pioneering and we've selected a few tools and capabilities, we do want to turn them into easily consumable capabilities for all the other teams, because that would help us to start building a uniform way of working. So we have the new features, we have the new tools, and then all the other teams can start working. And they've noticed and said, well, knowledge sharing and practice sharing is really, really important. So having bi-weekly knowledge sharing sessions or whatever is required to push that knowledge from one team to the other, to push it from the experts to the beginner teams, if you like. That is really important to start spreading it out. And at the same time, they also say is, hey, we cannot have 5 service mesh tools. We cannot have 10 deployment tools. So at any point in time, if you've surpassed or passed or come through the kind of the pioneering phase, you can now start selecting a few tools for each specific function and really start tying them together and start focusing on the consumption. So it's really, really good that all these possibilities are coming towards us. And why is that important? Because the majority of these little tools and these little frameworks that are shown here on the CloudFormation landscape do solve a really small piece of the puzzle. And bringing them together in guided orchestration helps you to utilize them, to consume them, and ultimately, again, to start pushing features out to production. Because remember, we're talking here about the IT performance, helping the enterprises to accelerate what they do and how they develop applications. And what we've discussed before, this immediately ties back into the responsive enterprise. It's not that much that all the distinct output matters. It is truly that how they come together and ultimately drive change for the business so they can achieve whatever they need to achieve. And honestly, I must admit, sometimes while experimenting with new technology, we're losing a little bit the bigger picture, right? We sometimes forget why we are doing particular stuff and why we are focused on utilizing new technology. So it's a great accelerator when used in the right way and with the right frameworks around it. So that is really important in here. And then the next section I want to quickly touch upon, and with this section we're finishing up the webinar, is moving forward, right? Because I can imagine you're saying, hey, Andreas, it's nice that all this technology is out there and that you do want to simplify, and I agree on it, but how do I move forward? And there are actually 3 issues that I do want to touch upon today. 3 issues that we see within our customer segment still being difficult and that they're still struggling with. So see it as 3 practical advices that you can use tomorrow. And the first one is really, really an important one. And that is the quality first thinking. And I believe the quality first thinking is important to improve, on one hand, customer satisfaction, and at the same time, optimize engineering capacity. And both of them go hand in hand. So let's start with the first one. By having a quality first mindset or thinking, what you will notice is that the amount of open incidents and the amount of tickets raised by the end user, by the customer, will go down time over time. This is important because the higher your customer satisfaction gets, the most likely they want to recommend the product towards their peers. And that is important because that will mean your business is growing. And the second thing, from a lean perspective, why it's so horrible to have many bugs and incidents coming in, it's all the time disrupting the flow of new feature development. So you can have a great vision, but if the quality is lacking and you have to work on a lot of incidents, you're not executing upon the goal that you've set. So in here, it's really important. We've talked about the simplification of the products and process, the simplification of your application stack, and this immediately pays off in the testing cycle, in the quality first. Why? The simpler your landscape and the simpler your products and process, the less exceptions and the less integration tests and the fewer end-to-end tests you need to execute, right? Because if there are not that much integrations with other tools, if components are more or less isolated in function, they can be tested and developed in isolation. And that helps you to accelerate your development because there are no weeks of end-to-end testing required. You just develop it, you test it, and you ship it. The second important element here is the shift left. And we've talked about it, and you can see we haven't talked about it, but many talks are given on the shift left. And in the last few years, we've seen how security practices are moving to the left, how static code scanning is now in the hands of the development teams, how container scanning is moving in there. And what I do believe is that more and more technology is moving into this direction and will help you to push this out. And then the last step in here, really important, is the automation capability as such. There are so many testing and quality tools out there that will help you not only to automate the testing itself, but also that start collecting the data and start warning whenever capabilities are failing in a really early stage. Whereas some people say observability is something for production, why not having the same observability, performance and security test tools in your development environment? So you can detect early decreases of performance going down or vulnerabilities coming up, right? Even before it's shipped to production, you can apply this on your earlier environments. And by utilizing automation, you're freeing up time to do the more intense thinking and discovery testing types of work that are important to find the boundaries and the edges of the system and see if it still works as designed. So quality first is important and crucial to move on. And then the second element is what I sometimes call connected pipelines. Because you can argue, Andreas, it's really nice that you talk about the simplification of my landscape, but my reality is that my payment stack still has 20 business applications stacked on each other to process a single payment, or a mortgage, or an insurance stack, or a telco, right? A new customer sign up still includes 8 or 10 different business applications. So the reality is that if you focus on delivery, a new customer delivery, not a new single change line of code, but something that truly impacts the customer, you need to renew or revisit how you take pipelines. So if you would draw a simple pipeline, it's one pipeline to fulfill or to deploy 4 different business applications. But that's not reality. Let's face the facts. It's not one pipeline. There's probably one pipeline for each and every application that you want to push out. And if this was reality, you're forgetting that the more modern customer-facing lightweight web applications most likely go much quicker. And the data lake, which is slightly older, handling hundreds of integrations, is probably much slower than the first one. Or if you take CI into account, there are many CI cycles contributing before you can push something out to production. And despite the fact that we strive for CI/CD, reality is for many teams that there are many CI cycles before it's picked up and truly released into the hands of the customer. And now the question is, how do you manage this superset of activities? And what we believe is that if it's still hard to solve the complexity, you need to manage it. It's probably not the best from a lean perspective, but it is important from a delivery perspective. So by understanding this, the main question would be, how can you align the distinct pipelines all at the same time so they can start running in a cadence? They have their own rhythm, but the rhythm is aligned with a bigger delivery. And what we believe at Digital.ai is that by focusing on the delivery, not the pipeline, but the delivery from a business perspective, you can start building insights, you can start gathering data, and ultimately you can start bringing all the code changes that are made by the engineering teams into the hands of the end customer. And by going one level up from your CI pipeline that you're running in Azure or in Jenkins and going into a delivery, we believe this is really important to satisfy the customer needs, which is reliable and sustainable process of executing one delivery after the other. And if you manage this, and that's what you can do, for example, with digital.ai release, you also start seeing what are my applications that are the bottlenecks, and what are my pipelines that I need to solve and that I need to accelerate. Or how can I disconnect the different layers in my application architecture so the customer facing app can go out independent, or at least for half of the releases can go independent. And I believe this is really important to ultimately, again, accelerate the delivery, right? Because imagine here, COVID-19, you want to push out a change, just a notification in your mobile app that is running on AWS, or your website that's running on AWS, with just a warning. And to do so, you need to do end-to-end testing with the entire stack underneath. That would take weeks, whereas the change needs to go out in just a matter of days. By understanding the complexity and solving it, it will help you to push that out really quickly. And then the last one I really want to highlight, and I touched upon it earlier, is what I call DevOps as a service. So I've talked about Ops Dev, experts defining patterns for teams to consume. But what we believe is you can take this much further. And it's proven with many customers that if you're in a large enterprise and you want to experiment, that the experiments happen more or less in isolation, but then scale it rapidly to all your teams. And the DevOps as a service thinking helps you to achieve this. Consumption-based, where practices are shared amongst the DevOps teams. And there are 4 elements important here. It is truly that services thinking, right? Because having a Helm chart as an output is not sufficient enough to push out applications in a reliable way, right? There's an entire pipeline needed. There are testing practices needed. So what is the end-to-end service that you need to offer for teams that want to push out applications in a modern fashion? And that is, the service is based on that predefined pattern that contains the knowledge of the expert, right? Because not all of our engineers all of a sudden tomorrow are Kubernetes experts. So how do you build these patterns? How do you experiment? How do you harden them? And how do you then prepare them for consumption so everyone can start using the knowledge and the skills of the expert? The third element, what I do believe organizations should focus on in a friendly and a positive way, is how can you enforce compliance and governance? And this is often perceived, what I've noticed in my previous job, this is often perceived as limiting autonomy. And I do believe with today's technology, you can pivot it the other way around. If you think about data-driven governance, the DevOps tools are producing so much data. How can you set up data-driven governance where data is collected in an automated manner and have your audit trail almost up to date on a day-to-day basis, where all the systems just produce the data which is stored and collected and reported upon in an automated fashion. And if you do so, the teams can just utilize the tools they utilize. You just have to set up the connection once, and then you're in control all the time. And then last but not least, this DevOps as a service thinking, I believe, will accelerate the DevOps adoption, or if you like, and to rephrase, will accelerate your digital transformation. And we've learned throughout the webinar that that is important to ultimately build that responsive enterprise and help the enterprise not only to do stuff, but to do it meaningful and to let it be connected towards the outcomes and the goals that an enterprise has set. What we've covered with this webinar is how the technology and how the practices ultimately lead towards a higher IT performance. And we've seen that the IT performance is one-on-one connected to the responsive enterprise. And this is helpful ultimately to do for an enterprise whatever is needed to grow and to survive in changing circumstances. I do hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I do wish you to stay safe and healthy in these days. Thank you so much.